I took the job because I needed the money. That was the truth of it. It wasn't a dream position, but it came with a paycheck and a roof over my head. And at that point, that was all I cared about. They told me it would be easy. Keep the light burning, the old man had said, his gnarled hands trembling as he handed me the key. Just keep the light burning, and you'll be fine. The lantern tower sat at the edge of Blackwater Bay, perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the endless sea. It was old, built long before modern lighthouses came into use, and it didn't seem to serve much of a purpose anymore. There were no ships to guide, no harbors to protect. Just me, the lantern, and the fog. Always the fog. I didn't question it at first. The fog rolled in every evening, thick and heavy, swallowing the cliffs and the waves below. It clung to the windows of the tower, muffling sound and casting strange, distorted shadows in the lantern's glow. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd climb the winding staircase to the top of the tower, light the lantern with the old brass key, and watch the flame burn steadily in its glass chamber. Then I'd settle into the small room at the base of the tower, listening to the distant crash of waves and the groan of the wind through the rocks. But on the fourth night, things changed. The fog came earlier than usual, rolling in before sunset and settling over the bay like a living thing. It was darker this time, thicker, and as I climbed the stairs to light the lantern, I noticed something strange. The lantern wasn't out. The flame was still burning, steady and bright, casting its pale glow across But the fog seemed wrong. It pressed against the glass like a solid mass, swirling and shifting in unnatural patterns. I leaned closer to the glass, squinting into the fog. That was when I saw it, a figure barely visible, standing at the edge of the cliff. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the lantern's flame. But as I watched, the figure moved, stepping closer to the base of the tower. My chest tightened. "Who's there?" I called, my voice muffled by the thick glass. The figure didn't respond. It stood motionless, just a dark outline against the swirling fog. I hurried back down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time I reached the bottom, the figure was gone. The fog pressed against the windows, heavier than ever, and as I stood there, catching my breath, I thought I heard something. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the door. The tapping was soft at first, almost imperceptible against the groan of the wind outside. But as I stood there, staring at the door, it grew louder, more deliberate, like the knock of knuckles on wood. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of quiet that makes you painfully aware of every creak, every breath, every beat of your heart. I took a hesitant step toward the door, the worn floorboards groaning beneath my weight. "Is someone there?" I tried again, louder this time. No answer. My hand hovered over the latch, my fingers trembling. The fog outside was so thick I couldn't see anything through the small, grimy window beside the door. For a moment, I considered leaving it shut, but then the tapping started again, slow and deliberate, each knock echoing through the small room. I couldn't take it anymore. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and yanked it open. Nothing. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling and dense, white tendrils that curled into the doorway like creeping fingers. The air was icy, damp, and carried a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. "You are here?" I called again, stepping out onto the rocky path that led to the cliff's edge. Still nothing. But as I turned to close the door, I noticed something. The ground in front of the tower was wet, not from rain or sea spray, but from footprints. They were faint, barely visible against the damp rock, but they were there, a trail of footprints leading away from the tower and vanishing into the fog. My stomach turned. "Who's out here?" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the oppressive mist. No reply. I followed the trail for a few steps, the cold seeping through my boots. The fog was so dense now that I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, the lantern's glow barely reaching this far from the tower. And then I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, soft and distant, impossible to make out. It wasn't a voice I recognized. Low and rhythmic, like a chant or a prayer. "Who's there?" I demanded, but my voice faltered. The whisper stopped. I turned back toward the tower, my breath visible in the freezing air. The door stood open, the warm glow of the lantern spilling out onto the rocky ground. It felt safe, comforting, even, and I hurried back, slamming the door behind me. But as I bolted it shut, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints hadn't been leading away from the tower. They had been coming toward it. I locked the door, twisting the bolt so hard it screeched. My fingers were trembling as I backed away, staring at the damp footprints leading straight up to the threshold. They weren't mine. I paced the small room, my mind racing. Maybe it was a fisherman who got lost in the fog. Maybe it was someone from the nearby village, though I hadn't seen a soul in the days I'd been here. But deep down, I knew better. The whispers still clung to the air, faint and distant, like a voice calling from just beyond the edge of my hearing. I grabbed the lantern key from my pocket and clenched it tightly, as if the small brass object could protect me. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and shaking the tower's old beams. I forced myself to climb the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The flame in the lantern needed checking, I told myself. That was all. This was routine. At the top of the tower, the lantern burned steadily, its pale light slicing through the fog. But the fog pushed back, thick and impenetrable, swirling against the glass like a living thing. I leaned closer, peering into the haze, and that was when I saw them. Shadows. They were faint at first, just ripples in the fog, but they moved. Slowly, deliberately, they shifted and twisted, their forms indistinct. My breath caught. "Hello," I called, though the glass muffled my voice. The shadows didn't respond. They simply circled, staying just at the edge of the lantern's glow. I couldn't tear my eyes away. There were at least 3 of them, their shapes humanoid but wrong, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. One of them stopped. It turned, or seemed to turn, toward the tower, its shadowy form stretching as it leaned closer to the light. The lantern flickered. "No," I whispered, fumbling with the key. I opened the small door at the base of the lantern and turned the key in its lock, feeding the flame. It flared briefly, brighter than before, and the shadow recoiled, retreating into the fog. My chest heaved as I stared into the swirling mist. The other shadows moved back as well, but they didn't leave. They were waiting. The whispers grew louder, rising in a rhythmic cadence that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the wind, it was them. I backed away from the lantern, my legs shaking. As I descended the stairs, the sound followed me, the faint, overlapping voices weaving together in an unintelligible chant. When I reached the bottom, the room felt colder. The door was still bolted, but the damp footprints had spread, trailing across the floor in patterns that made no sense. I grabbed a chair and jammed it under the door handle for good measure, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers were louder now, closer, and they didn't stop. I sank into the corner, clutching the key like a lifeline. And then, through the fogged window, I saw the shadow of a hand. It pressed against the glass, long fingers splayed wide, the faint outline of something too thin, too sharp. The whispers stopped. A single voice cut through the silence. "Let us in." The voice sent a jolt through me, low and resonant, cutting through the oppressive silence like a knife. It wasn't muffled by the thick glass or distorted by the wind outside. It sounded as if it was right there, inches from my ear. "Let us in?" I pressed myself deeper into the corner, clutching the brass key so tightly it dug into my palm. My eyes were fixed on the window. The hand was still there, its long, bony fingers splayed against the fog glass. "Go away," I croaked, my voice trembling. The shadow didn't move. The hand remained pressed against the glass, impossibly still, as if it were waiting. The lantern's light above flared briefly, casting a pale glow through the fog, and for a moment the hand faded. I thought it was gone. Then the voice returned, colder this time, and closer. "We cannot leave." A loud thud made me jump, my heart slamming against my ribs. The chair I had jammed under the door handle shuddered, as if something had struck the door from outside. I scrambled to my feet, staring at the door. Another thud followed, louder this time, the chair creaking under the strain. The whispers returned, swirling around the room like a suffocating cloud. They overlapped in an incomprehensible chant, rising and falling in waves that made the air seem heavier. "Stay out!" I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the whispers. The thudding stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the rasp of my own breathing. I stepped toward the door, my legs trembling, and pressed my ear against the cold wood. Nothing. The window shattered. I screamed, spinning around as shards of glass rained onto the floor. The fog poured into the room like smoke, coiling and twisting in unnatural patterns. My flashlight flickered in the chaos, its beam cutting through the haze just long enough for me to see it. A figure. It was standing just beyond the broken window, its form tall and gaunt, its limbs stretched too far to be human. Its face was obscured by the fog, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold, unblinking, and impossibly heavy. "Keep the light burning," it said, though the voice didn't match its form. It was the old man's voice, the one who had handed me the key on my first day. "Who are you?" I demanded, backing away toward the stairs. The figure didn't answer. It stepped closer, its long, bony fingers gripping the edge of the broken window. The whispers surged again, and the lantern's light above flickered violently, dimming for a brief, terrifying moment. The fog seemed to grow thicker, the air colder, and I felt an unnatural weight settle over the room. The figure stepped inside. Its movements were slow and deliberate, its elongated limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. The fog clung to it like a shroud, masking its face, but I didn't need to see it to know that it wasn't human. "You let us in," it said, its voice layered with the whispers. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "Stay away." I turned and bolted up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I climbed. The whispers followed, louder and more frantic, their chaotic rhythm drowning out the sound of my own pounding heart. When I reached the top, I slammed the lantern chamber shut and turned the key. The flame flared, brighter than I'd ever seen it, casting a harsh white light that spilled out into the fog. The whispers stopped. I collapsed against the wall, clutching my chest as the silence returned, heavy and oppressive. The fog outside the glass seemed to retreat, swirling further from the tower as the lantern's light burned steady and strong. But as I caught my breath, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The figure was still there, standing at the edge of the lantern's glow, watching. And it wasn't alone. They were everywhere. Shapes moved at the edges of the lantern's glow, circling the tower like predators stalking their prey. Some were tall and spindly, their limbs unnaturally long and twisting, while others were smaller, hunched figures that scuttled along the ground like insects. The fog wasn't just swirling anymore. It was alive, writhing with their movements, bending to their will. I pressed myself against the wall, staring out at the figures beyond the glass. The largest of them stood still, its gaunt frame barely visible at the edge of the light. Its head tilted slightly, its hollow gaze fixed on me. "Keep the light burning," I whispered to myself, clutching the brass key so tightly it bit into my skin. "Just keep the light burning." But even as I said it, the lantern flickered. A shiver raced down my spine as the light dimmed for a fraction of a second, the shadows surging closer in response. The whispers returned, faint and insidious, threading through the cold air like an unseen web. The large figure raised a hand, its long, bony fingers curling toward me. "We cannot be kept out forever," it said, its voice resonating through the chamber. "The light fades." "No!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. "It won't fade. I won't let it." I opened the lantern's chamber, turning the key to feed the flame. The fire flared briefly, its light cutting through the fog and forcing the shadows to recoil. But it wasn't enough. The figures didn't retreat entirely. They lingered just beyond the edge of the light, their movements slower but no less deliberate. "You are running out of time," the figure said, its voice calm and measured. "The lantern cannot burn forever." My hands trembled as I closed the chamber, my breath visible in the freezing air. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, its movements unnervingly fluid. "You were chosen," it said simply. "Chosen for what?" It didn't answer. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made my head pound. The smaller figures pressed closer, their forms writhing and contorting as they moved. I turned away from the glass, pacing the narrow chamber at the top of the tower. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The lantern, the fog, the figures. It wasn't just coincidence. It was a test. The thought hit me like a wave, and I froze. The old man's words echoed in my mind. "Keep the light burning, and you'll be fine." What if the light wasn't just a tool? What if it was the only thing holding them back? I rushed to the glass, my eyes darting between the figures. They hadn't moved closer, but their presence was suffocating. The largest one stood motionless, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the fog. Then, from somewhere deep within the fog, a new sound emerged. A low, guttural growl, rumbling like distant thunder. The figures stopped moving. The whispers fell silent, and the fog parted. For a brief moment, I saw it, a massive shape, far larger than the figures surrounding the tower. Its form was indistinct, a heaving mass of shadow and sinew that pulsed with each low growl. The light flickered again. "No," I whispered, my chest tightening. I turned back to the lantern, fumbling with the key. "Stay bright. Stay burning." The flame flared as I fed it again, but this time, the light didn't push the shadows back. The figures remained still, their hollow gazes fixed on the tower as the massive shape loomed closer. I could feel its presence pressing against the walls, heavy and cold, suffocating. The growling grew louder, a deep vibration that shook the tower to its core. The largest figure stepped forward, its form breaking the edge of the light. "You cannot stop it," it said, its voice cold and final. "The light will fail." The tower trembled under the weight of the growling, the low, guttural sound vibrating through the walls and into my chest. The flame in the lantern flickered violently, its pale glow struggling against the darkness pressing in from all sides. I turned the key frantically, feeding the flame as much as I could, but the light barely steadied. It was weaker now, and I could feel the toll it was taking on the tower, on me. The largest figure stood at the edge of the glow, its bony hand outstretched. "You cannot keep it burning," it said, its voice calm yet absolute. "The light is not yours to command." "What are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Why are you here?" It tilted its head, its elongated form casting jagged shadows against the fog. "We are the truth," it said, "and the light is a lie." The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I faltered. The light a lie? That couldn't be true. The lantern was the only thing holding them back, the only barrier between me and whatever they were. I shook my head violently, trying to block out its voice. "You're lying," I shouted. "The light is the only thing stopping you." The figure's hollow gaze bore into me. "The light is not stopping us," it said. "It is calling us." My blood ran cold. The growling intensified, the sound now so loud it drowned out my thoughts. The fog thickened, pressing against the glass like a living thing, and I felt the air grow colder, heavier. I backed away from the lantern, my legs shaking. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself. "This can't be real." The flame flickered again, weaker this time, and I realized something horrifying. The key wasn't working anymore. No matter how much I turned it, the light wouldn't grow stronger. "You were chosen to keep it burning," the figure said, stepping closer. "But all flames die." "No!" I screamed, slamming the chamber shut. "You're lying. I can fix it." The whispers returned, louder than ever, a chaotic symphony that filled the room. The smaller figures pressed closer, their twisted forms writhing at the edge of the light. And then I saw it, the massive shape in the fog. It was moving toward the tower, its hulking form barely visible through the swirling mist. It didn't walk or crawl. It flowed, its shifting mass defying any logic or sense. The growling came from it, vibrating through the air like a force of nature. The largest figure turned its head toward the shape, then back to me. "It comes," it said simply. "What does it want?" I demanded, tears streaming down my face. "You." The word hung in the air, cold and absolute. The fog pressed harder against the glass, and I saw cracks begin to form, tiny fissures spreading like spiderwebs. The light from the lantern grew weaker still, its once brilliant glow now a dim, flickering ember. I turned back to the lantern, my hands trembling. "Stay lit," I begged, turning the key again and again. "Please stay lit." But the flames sputtered, barely clinging to life. The whispers grew louder, and the figures moved closer. The fog seeped through the cracks in the glass, curling into the room like smoke. And then the lantern went out. The moment the lantern went dark, the room plunged into a suffocating blackness that felt alive, pressing in from every direction. The whispers exploded into a deafening roar, a chaotic symphony of voices overlapping and writhing in my ears. I stumbled backward, my hands frantically searching for something, anything to hold on to. But the room had changed. The solid walls and familiar staircase were gone, replaced by an endless void of cold, swirling fog. "Stay away!" I screamed into the dark, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the oppressive presence surrounding me. The growling returned, deeper and closer now, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The massive shape loomed ahead, its shifting form visible only as a faint distortion in the fog. Then the voice came again. "You have failed." It wasn't a single voice anymore. It was a chorus, layered and alien, reverberating through my bones. "I didn't fail," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I kept the light burning." The fog swirled violently, and the largest figure emerged from the shadows, its long limbs unfolding as it stepped closer. "You kept it burning," it said, its voice like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. But the light was never meant to last. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its hollow gaze fixed on me. "The flame was a beacon," it said. "It called us here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. "Called you? Why? For what?" "To bring balance," it said. Before I could respond, the massive shape in the fog shifted again, its presence now so immense it felt like the very air was being drawn toward it. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, rhythmic pounding, like the beating of a colossal heart. The smaller figures began to move, their twisted forms slithering and crawling toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural. "No!" I screamed, turning to run, but there was nowhere to go. The fog surrounded me, endless and suffocating, and the figures were closing in from all sides. The largest figure extended its hand, its long, bony fingers reaching for me. "You are the flame now," it said. Before I could process the words, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling through the void, the whispers rising again in a chaotic crescendo. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my very core, and the darkness felt like it was pulling me apart piece by piece. As I fell, the massive shape loomed above me, its shifting form filling the entire void. The pounding grew louder, faster, until it felt like my own heartbeat was syncing with its rhythm. And then everything stopped. I was no longer falling. I was standing somewhere. The fog had cleared, revealing a barren, desolate landscape stretching endlessly in all directions. The air was still and heavy, the sky above an unbroken expanse of black. In the distance, I saw it, a single light, faint and flickering, standing alone in the dark. It was the lantern. The flickering light in the distance was impossibly faint, barely more than a pinprick against the oppressive darkness. But it was there, a fragile ember burning in the void. I stumbled toward it, my legs weak and unsteady, the barren ground crunching beneath my boots. The cold was relentless, biting into my skin with every step, and the silence around me was heavier than ever. The whispers were gone. Even the growling had faded, leaving only the sound of my labored breathing and the faint, rhythmic pulse of the lantern's light. As I drew closer, I saw that the lantern wasn't on a tower anymore. It stood on a simple iron pedestal, its frame battered and blackened, the flame inside flickering weakly. But I wasn't alone. Figures surrounded the lantern, their forms twisted and distorted, their faces obscured by shadow. They stood motionless, their heads bowed as if in reverence, their hands outstretched toward the light. My breath caught as I recognized some of them. The old man who had given me the key, a fisherman I'd seen once in the nearby village, a woman whose picture hung in the tower's tiny office, her eyes smiling in an old, faded photograph. They were all here, their hollow eyes fixed on the lantern, their expressions blank and lifeless. "What is this?" I whispered, though my voice barely carried. None of them moved. The lantern pulsed again, its light flaring briefly before dimming. The figures seemed to shift in unison, their bodies swaying as if drawn to the rhythm of the flame. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" The light flickered violently, and for a moment I thought it would go out. Then one of the figures turned. Its movements were slow and deliberate, its face hidden in shadow. It raised one bony hand, pointing directly at the lantern. "The flame must be kept," it said, its voice low and resonant, layered with a dozen others. I shook my head, my chest tightening. "I tried," I said, my voice trembling. "I kept it burning. I did everything I was supposed to do." "You failed," the figure said simply. The words hit me like a blow, and I stumbled back, my eyes darting between the motionless figures. "Why? Why did it fail? What did I do wrong?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward the lantern again, its hand trembling slightly. "The flame must be kept," it repeated. "Take your place." I turned to the lantern, my stomach churning. The brass key was still clutched in my hand, its edges biting into my skin. "What happens if I don't?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The figures didn't move, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their hands still outstretched toward the light. And then from somewhere deep within the void, the growling returned. It was louder this time, closer, and the ground beneath me trembled as the sound reverberated through the air. The massive shape loomed again, its shifting form barely visible at the edge of the darkness. The lantern pulsed weakly, its flame guttering, and the figures began to chant. "You are the flame now." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, I'm not. I didn't ask for this." The growling grew louder, the massive shape surging closer. The air grew colder, heavier, and the light from the lantern dimmed even further. The chanting rose into a deafening crescendo, and the figures turned toward me in unison, their faces finally visible in the faint glow. They were me, dozens of faces, all mine, staring back at me with empty eyes and lifeless expressions. "The flame must be kept," they said together. And then the lantern went out. The moment the lantern's light extinguished, the darkness surged forward, consuming everything. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was alive, pressing against my skin, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. The figures were gone, swallowed by the void. The ground beneath me vanished, and I felt weightless, drifting through an endless expanse of cold and silence. Then the whispers returned. They weren't chaotic this time. They were deliberate, synchronized, each word cutting through the dark with chilling clarity. "You are the flame?" "No!" I screamed, my voice echoing into the void. "I didn't want this. I didn't ask for any of this." The growling emerged from the silence, a deep, guttural sound that made my bones vibrate. It was closer than ever, surrounding me, filling the void with its presence. The massive shape appeared again, its shifting form blotting out even the faintest glimmers of light. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, and I felt its weight settle over me, pressing into my chest like an unbearable burden. "You failed the flame," the layered voice said, resonating from within the darkness. "Now you will become it." "No!" I shouted again, thrashing against the invisible force holding me in place. The shape loomed closer, its form twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and all-consuming. A faint glow began to appear in the distance, a tiny ember flickering weakly against the darkness. It grew brighter as the massive shape advanced, its light cutting through the void like a razor. It was the lantern. It hovered in the darkness, suspended in the air, its battered frame glowing faintly. The flame inside was small, barely alive, but it burned. The voices swelled again, louder this time, chanting in perfect unison. The flame must be kept. The massive shape paused, its shifting form rippling with tension. I felt the pressure around me lessen slightly, as if it, too, was drawn to the flickering light. "You are the flame," the voices repeated. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I can't do this." The lantern moved closer, its light growing brighter. I could see the brass key dangling from its side, glinting faintly in the glow. The massive shape let out a deafening growl, its form surging forward to engulf the light. Without thinking, I reached out. The moment my fingers touched the lantern, the darkness erupted into chaos. The growling turned into a roar, and the whispers reached a fever pitch, crashing over me like a tidal wave. The light from the lantern flared, blinding and all-consuming, and I felt a searing pain spread through my chest. The flame wasn't just in the lantern anymore. It was in me. The searing pain spread through me like fire, radiating from my chest and consuming every nerve in my body. I collapsed to my knees, clutching at the air as the lantern's light blazed, brighter than anything I'd ever seen. The darkness around me recoiled, writhing and twisting, its presence dissolving under the intensity of the flame. The massive shape let out a deafening roar, its form rippling as it tried to escape the light. But there was no escape. The lantern's flame burned brighter and brighter, its heat sinking into my very being. I felt my body change, become something more, something other. The whispers didn't stop, but now they were inside me, a constant murmur in the back of my mind. "You are the flame," the voices said again, soft but unrelenting. The massive shape let out one final growl before it disintegrated, its shadowy form scattering like ash into the void. The figures I had seen before, twisted, distorted reflections of myself, melted into the darkness, leaving me alone in the endless expanse. And then, the lantern's light dimmed. I looked down and saw it wasn't in my hand anymore. The flame was no longer contained in glass or metal. It burned within me now, a pulsing ember nestled in my chest. The ground beneath me reappeared, solid and cold. The void dissolved, replaced by the familiar walls of the tower. The fog outside was still there, swirling against the glass, but it no longer pressed in with the same suffocating weight. I stood slowly, my legs trembling as I adjusted to the silence. The brass key was still in my hand, its surface warm, as if it too carried the flame. The whispers inside me grew softer, fading into the background like a distant memory. I stepped toward the lantern chamber at the top of the tower, placing the key back into its lock. The flame inside was gone, but the tower was bathed in a faint, golden glow radiating from within me. I peered out through the glass, my breath fogging the surface. The figures were gone, the fog still dense, but no longer alive with their movements. For the first time, the tower felt calm, but deep down, I knew the truth. The lantern's light hadn't kept the figures away. It had called them. It had brought them here, just as it had brought me. And now I was its keeper. I sat down in the chair near the chamber, the brass key still clutched tightly in my hand. The whispers had told me this was my place now, and I understood. The flame wasn't just a source of light. It was a responsibility, a burden passed down from one keeper to the next. The fog outside swirled, heavy and silent, and I felt its weight pressing against the edges of my mind. The flame must be kept.